Hello everybody, and welcome to our last office hours session of the year. Can't believe it's the end of 2016, but at the moment it feels like 2016 can't go fast enough, can it? Because this is the last session of the month, we've got a theme for the session, and today we're going to talk about account models. I'm not sure that we really have any specific demos for you, but we thought it's an interesting topic and question, and something that we may be able to get into a slightly deeper conversation about basically how you structure and put your structure the data in your Salesforce instance. But despite the fact that this is a theme session, it's the usual thing. If you have a question for our panel, please put it in chat, and we'll keep an eye on the chat as we're talking, and we can break off and answer your question or continue our discussion around your question as we go. I'm not awake this morning, obviously. So welcome to Sarah, Susan, and Beth, and here we are, and let's get started. So I thought a really good thing to start with for those who are on the call who might think, "What on earth are we talking about? What are account models?" Would any of you like to venture on what you think an account model is, or how do you explain it to the organizations that you work with?
Well, I think you probably have a good group of people here because we probably do different things. I know I tend to be in the minority in that I pretty much never implement the household model, only because I don't work with organizations that have a primary or even majority need for fundraising. So I work traditionally with larger organizations that just don't have really individual fundraising. But so, what I explain to people is that in Salesforce, every contact requires an account, no matter whether they have a meaningful relationship to an organization or not. And so if the contact in question, doesn't have a meaningful relationship to an organization, you have to pick a type of account to give them. And in the situations where, that I implement, those choices are either a one-to-one or a bucket account. But obviously a household account would be the third type of account that you could give to someone. And there's also, the option of having a meaningful relationship with an organization as the primary account for that person. And so you either wind up doing one of three things. You have the person's primary account be a household. You have the person's primary account be a one-to-one account, meaning that that person has a one account with their name on it that represents them and passes them into the contact record. Or you have a type of a bucket account where you kind of throw everybody into one or more buckets, usually that are not very meaningful, just to capture the fact that they're individuals. And then you can have a hybrid model, which uses either the one-to-one or the bucket account, with, in addition, another layer of having those people relate to their primary organization as their employee-employer relationship.
And your in the sorts of organizations that you're working with, Sarah, do most people fall into that employer-employee, so that
Yes.
usually they're working for a company, and you just have, I guess, the simplest of the account models, or the one that perhaps Salesforce was designed for, which is that the account is the business, and they're the employee.
Well, I would say that in the organizations we work with, it's not a majority of the contacts that have an employer-employee relationship, but a chunk of them. So we always utilize a hybrid model where those that you know the employer for and it's meaningful in your context, you set it. And for the other ones that you either don't know or it's not related to the context in which you're working, they get either a one-to-one or bucket account, depending on a number of factors to decide which of those two models you kind of implement as part of the hybrid.
You can hybrid with household too, though, right? Like you can
Yes.
have some folks,
Yep.
yeah, thanks, Susan. You
I
can
think
have
you're not
some,
supposed to though, but you certainly can.
yeah, and if you
It,
do household, there's certain features that you also gain that are
right.
not available when you're using individual bucket or one-to-one. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to pull up the documentation on what those are, and I
And
am not
that's
finding it.
fine. Well,
So
you
I
carry
know
on,
you asked
and
me to get
and I mean, while we're and just for anyone who's kind of new in the Salesforce world, what we're talking about with these one-to-ones and the buckets and the households are the account models that you get if you're using the nonprofit success pack. Um, so one more before we just dive in. I mean, why does this account model matter so much? I mean, couldn't you just have contacts with any accounts? I mean, is the account, what's the importance or the relevance of the account? Because there's
It's going to
another
impact how
object,
your
isn't
data
there?
can roll up.
Sorry. Go
How you
ahead,
can
Beth. Yes.
it's going to impact how your data can roll up, how you can slice and dice your data, and I'll say that I use Household on almost all my projects. I'll be the reverse of Sarah. Um, but my projects aren't fundraising either. We do mostly human services organizations, supportive housing, supportive employment, that sort of thing. And that also lends itself very nicely to the household account model, where you're tracking who are all of these folks who sort of go together, but in their personal sense, in their citizen of the world sense, I like to call it. Like, we don't necessarily care where they work, though you can also track that with a separate piece called affiliations. But the primary thing we care about those folks, as far as what group do they really belong to, is their household. So that's sort of the core of the household model.
Yeah, and I would say that I'm closer to Beth, and my background's a little bit different, where I'm coming from the financial accounting apps, and so in the accounting world, you know, you need to have most of the other apps work with the account, not so much the contacts, and that's how we need to deal with them. And we use the hybrid model of the household account and then set up record types for those that need to be organizational accounts like vendors or partners. So we do kind of use that hybrid when looking at financial pieces.
And I think the finance is an important bit of it, isn't it, Susan? Because I think one of the things that frequently confuses people when they start is about opportunities or
Mm-hmm.
donations. And I think people often don't understand that an opportunity has to be associated with an account, don't they? I mean, people look at the
Yeah,
contact roles and they think, oh, that's great. And actually, there's
right.
this rather more complex relationship, isn't there, where opportunities are concerned.
Right, and then the downstream, as far as if you know, there's pushing to the whatever the finance or accounting app that they're using um, would requires a lot of times the accountant and won't look at the contact.
Yeah.
So
a question on that though. I thought that, well, but does it actually need multiple people in a household to be in that one account, or are you using the household account more as a one-to-one?
Absolutely, almost always as a one-to-one. Like, yes, definitely. Like
Yeah.
it ends up being very similar, so long as there is only one person in that account, but that's totally fine. You don't have to have more than one person in a household to make it a meaningful household account.
Um,
But it allows you to link together those people who do live together, which the one-to-one would not. In the
right.
one-to-one, you would have, Jane Doe and John Doe would be completely isolated from one another. But with a household, the first one, it would look the same when you enter them, but then when you enter the second, it's like, oh, but they actually go together.
Hmm. And I think if you set up like the one-to-one, it doesn't allow you to go to the household model if how you're collected, if you're changing. I mean, you'd have to do a migration. Whereas with the household model, if you're actually using the one-to-one, you can leverage the household versus you can't do it the other way around. You'd actually have to
Say that again,
change the
Susan. I
account
didn't
type.
follow that.
So if you're using the household, but you're setting it up like a one-to-one, you can use it that way. And then if you actually do have households where you want to leverage the household piece, you can
Yeah.
do that easily without having to migrate your
Right.
a model. But if
Oh
you
yeah.
had set it up as the one-to-one account model, you can't then actually change it to household.
We can
You'd
pretty
have to use the
easily.
migration.
Yeah, you'd have to migrate
Yeah,
it, but
it's
it's,
pretty
yeah.
simple though.
Yeah,
I
it's
I would just caution for our listeners on the phone that I wouldn't use a fear of future migration as a reason to choose one household model or another. The thing about the households is quite confusing is that what it does is kind of bastardize the account in a way that some accounts are representing an actual physical like house that people live in, and some of them are representing organizations. And so and the page views that you have when you use a household model of somebody's household are very specific to households. They have all those really nice bells and whistles around, what's their like joint mailing address and how many people are in this household and how do I add and remove members. And if that's something that your company doesn't use, then I would not choose that account model because it will confuse the people who are using the system. However, I think Beth said that if you're doing health and human services where you're really looking to show metrics based on a household and the unit of people you serve as in a household, it makes a ton of sense to use it for that reason. Or if you're doing fundraising where you're actually wanting to thank people in a household, count donations per household, have soft credits, basically, do kind of fundraising household-based activities is also a really good reason to use it. I'm sure there are some others as well. Um, but I would not choose it just as a default because that's the way that the nonprofit starter pack is encouraging you to choose.
It is an interesting one though to dig into because I think one of the feelings is that having a mixture of models can be confusing. And I think I've certainly seen organizations that used to use the one-to-one account that used to get quite confused about creating a contact associated with an organization. And so if they were creating an employee of an employer, often they would wonder why they couldn't see the employer, and it was perhaps because they were using the wrong record type. So I can see that I think you have to understand what's going on, and that maybe in some cases it's more straightforward to think of every organization that has a contact of any kind, or that contact should always live with a household, because that means you just have one way of creating contacts. I mean, what do you think about that, Beth? Because I know, I know you'd asked yesterday whether you, in our sort of planning for this call, about whether that's still the recommended way and the default. And I know that's what Salesforce.org do recommend. But I think it's to say it's to provide some clarity with this idea that any contact, if you have a contact, you should always create that first and create a household with it, even if you only know that contact in the context of where they work, for example.
Yeah, and Susan made a good point that if the person that you're talking to, like if their most meaningful relationship to your organization is through their employment, to still make them as a contact who sits directly in a household account and then to use, excuse me, affiliations to represent their employment, it does make it easier to track them if they may move employers, which certainly happens in the nonprofit world. Folks might move organizations and you might still be dealing with them in their new employment and having them just still sit in that little placeholder household account, but have the affiliations tracking that history of their employment becomes really powerful and much easier to deal with to track that history of employment.
Yeah, it takes a bit more setting up perhaps in the first place, and then becomes easier, as you say, later on once people start moving on.
Yeah,
So,
you just have to understand, like, I mean, the model that is recommended by .org is every contact sits in a household and use affiliations to track employment when it's relevant. You certainly can do a hybrid, and I have implemented hybrid models where our constituents, who are the people we're providing services to, get household accounts, and then the folks who are representing vendors and partners and agencies and caseworkers and things like that, where we care about their employment, those sit under organization accounts. And that certainly works too. Tracking that history of employment would be the argument for the former model.
Right. And it's true that Salesforce.org does recommend using the household model, which has been a point of consternation for a number of consultants, which is, so I'll be the I'll be the voice of those consultants. But if you imagine an organization that does accreditation of some sort of organization, like even if it's health and human service orgs, what they do is work with organizations to accredit them, and those organizations go through a massive multi-year process, and there's portals involved, and the only players in your system are the organizations that are getting accredited. So the only people are the people who work for those organizations.
Yep.
If they were in a household, that would be ridiculous. People using the system would be like, "Ooh, that's so private. Like, why am I looking at a household for a professional relationship?"
Totally agree with you, Sarah. Totally agree with you that that's not a use case for a household account model. Absolutely not.
Right. And so I would just say that while the Nonprofit Starter Pack does have a lot of nice bells and whistles around the household account, it is not always the appropriate model to use for an organization. You have to do a lot of thought up front as to which model actually makes sense for your organization.
Well, I think in that vein, there are definitely nonprofits where the NPSP is not the proper setup.
Correct.
Yep.
Where they actually look better as a regular org.
Correct.
Vanilla, we call that.
Yes. So
it's interesting. Did you see Pierre's comments? Hi, Pierre. You're on the verge of loading about 200,000 contacts for your nonprofit organization, about 75% of which are families, and the rest are corporate sponsors, such as John Smith at Acme Corp. So far, I'm planning to stay as vanilla as possible. I think here you're meaning vanilla nonprofit starter pack, success pack, but we'll ask you in a minute. So John Smith at Acme Corp still gets a household record. If you're on the line, Pierre, please feel free to comment. But yeah,
and
so
I do mean vanilla NPSP.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that actually these corporate sponsors often that is a good case for having a household for them, because it's probably the relationship you have with that individual that counts, isn't it? It's always
And
asking
there is,
Go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, there is always a chance, a fairly strong chance of having crossover. So this is the American Junior Golf Association, where a corporate sponsor might have his child playing as a member, and so he could, that person could be a corporate sponsor as well as a parent.
That's a great case for, householding everybody and using affiliations. I would agree with you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Can I just ask one other quick question without writing it down? So this American Junior Golf Association, they also do a lot of fundraising. The kids who play actually do fundraising. They bring money into the organization, and they all have a partner charity. So, American Cancer Society, if their grandmother passed away from cancer, they often have a pet charity, and so they will then bring in aunts, uncles, friends, neighbors, donating to their particular cause, kind of a GoFundMe page for the young golfer. And then there's a ratio, I don't know if it's 50-50 or what, of that fundraising that stays within the HAGA and the other portion that goes out to the American Cancer Society or whatever the partner charity is. So I had posted the question on the community a few weeks ago about how I should be handling those, and I got a little bit of discussion going, and I ended up, and again, it's all in Sandbox up until now. I've created those partner charities as accounts and added a filtered lookup for those accounts on the opportunity, on the donation record.
And you're using the primary or account/organization lookup to go to the household.
Correct.
Sounds
And
reasonable.
is it the case that there's always one organization that any given donation will be partnered with and not more?
No, it's typically it is just one as far as I can tell, and it's only on about 10% of the donations that are in the system that there's actually a partner charity.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to have done it that way. If there could be multiple partner charities, you would want a junction object, but because there's only one, having a lookup makes it more direct and
Right.
clear. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Agreed. And if they did ever go to a model where they needed more than one, that migration from a lookup to a junction object wouldn't be
It's quite
horrible.
easy. Yeah.
Right. Okay, thanks.
And maybe instead of the junction object, perhaps you could use allocations, the GAUs at that point. Actually,
Right, I was thinking of doing something with that because and again, I don't have all the details at this point, but if some of those arrangements are 50-50 and some are 40-60, then I may need to get into a little bit more automation depending on who the partner charity is.
Yeah, I suppose it's a slightly unconventional way of using allocations, but it's always like if you've got something that's nearly there, it's always better to leverage than start building custom. Now that's an interesting question. Let's take Edith that's just come in because I think that's great, and then we might come back to Andy's, which is about naming your households. So thanks for the question, Edith. When you're migrating or importing, how do you create the account type to equal an organization? What fields are required to create an organization type rather than a household?
So you'd have to put in the record type. So you'd have to get the record type IDs and then input those in.
Well, yeah. So I guess the question is this a question about actual record type, or has it even been record type, or is the question about how to choose an account model?
Edith, are you there? Can you talk to us? Hi. So yes, is this choosing what type of account something should be as you're importing? Tell us a bit more.
Well, I think we decided to use organization, although I'm listening to your argument of household, and so I might think about that. But for right now, we're setting up all of our accounts as organizations until we find out that they're household, because there is a one-to-one relationship between the business and the contact. But I was moving things around and importing them because we haven't always used Salesforce, so we need to do a little cleanup and migrate accounts into Salesforce. And I noticed when I migrated them, they always came out to be household. and I was wondering what field is needed. And I hear
Oh,
you
yes.
say ID. So I mean, I don't know the ID of a brand new account that I'm importing into Salesforce.
She was saying the record type ID, and that's correct if you're having them go in as households, and it's being displayed on the screen right here. So there's two ways to get the ID of a record type. One is to go to the list of record types for an account and click on it, um, and it will show you the ID in the URL. The other way up there, it says like the ID. The other way to do it is very similar. If you go to account and you hit new, uh, it's going to show you record type ID equals up at when you choose a record type under new, it will then, oh, she's going to do it. This is awesome. Vanna White here on the left. And you hit continue, it's going to show you up in the bar the record type ID for that. See how it's very little, but see how it says record type equals? That's also the record type ID that you can put in. But if you're not using households and they're going in as households, then you probably have a slight misconfiguration. So you should go back to the account record types list and deactivate the household record type if you're not using it. And it also means that if you're the sysadmin, your profile has a default of household right now. That's why it would be going in as household. So you probably want to go to the household account record type and you hit edit and then you basically deactivate it. But then the other thing you can do if you don't want to deactivate it for some reason is you would go into your profile and set the default to be the record type that you want these created as, because it would mean that right now your default is set to households. So she's also going to show you.
That's a great idea. Thank you. Thank you
You
so
have
much.
this one. I don't use this view of profiles because of the 700 clicks required. Yeah, so wherever in this model the default record type is, you would change it. Oh, up
Great.
there.
And then I
Yeah.
can always change it back when I want to use household.
And in fact, Edith, for accounts, if you are using the household model, it's actually always recommended that the default record type for everybody should be organization. Because if you're creating a household, or because of what's in the nonprofit success pack, you would always go to a contact, or you'd usually go to a contact first, and the household would be created for you automatically. So if you're creating a new account, you tend to be creating an organization anyway, rather than a household. So I would just go and set the default record type to be organization for everybody, whether
Great.
you
Thank you so
activate
much.
households or not.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So while we're on just on households, we had a question right back at the beginning from Andy Wong about Salesforce defaulting to the last name as the household. What if they are not related? You mean if you end up with lots of Smith households, Andy, presumably?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so what if I have two Smiths that are not related? Should I use Smith 1, Smith 2?
And do you know what
It might
version?
look like it's the same household, but it's probably not. And maybe Caroline, can you create two separate Smiths
Okay,
and
so
show that
basically,
the ID is different? Yeah, it's going to look the same, and you do have to be careful when you're grouping in reports by household name. You can't do that, but you can either add the first name to the naming convention, which will make it a little bit clearer. So it would be Joe Smith household,
okay,
or you can do other things in reporting. But yeah, it probably just looks like they're the same, but they're not actually the same account. They're just named the same.
okay, so we will have two Smith, but they will be related differently.
Yeah, they have different Salesforce IDs, so they're
Okay.
different records.
Okay. So I just leave it alone, use the default, whatever's created for me.
Well, you can change how your format's gonna change. You can add the first name in, as Beth was saying.
So that's the usual convention.
I think it depends on what you want to do, but you can definitely make that change.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, I would look at this if you're using if you have this NPSP settings tab and you're using a more recent version of the Nonprofit Success Pack, even if you're using separate households, the separate household object, this will still apply. So you have this whole tab of household settings and you can choose. And I agree, I think it's very confusing if you always just use the last name. So there are some suggestions that you can add first name as well. You can get quite fancy with these if you like, but yeah, I remember having an organization where I had actually, well, it was Kim's actually. We had an awful lot of Kim households, even more than Smith's. And yes, we used to have Kim 1 and Kim 2. And after a while, it just got really confusing. You couldn't remember which Kim was which after a while. So we definitely went for this. We looked for something different and ended up using last name and using the first name as well. And that made the whole thing much clearer. You could even put, I don't know, you can even put part of an address field or something. You could have the last name and the city or something if that helped to make it clearer.
Yeah, just to make it unique. Okay, thank you very much. That helps.
Great. So let's see if we can dig into Myra Carr's question. I'm an admin for an enterprise nonprofit that currently uses the Sales Cloud to manage sales of our educational and conference programs to schools and other organizations. So she's using a standard business-to-business account model that's vanilla Salesforce without the nonprofit success pack. It's on our roadmap a year or so down the road to migrate our fundraising team from Razor's Edge into Salesforce as well. Great. Good luck with that. Would you recommend a hybrid model so that we can have both the household model for individual donors and the organization for institutional donors? And I'm also curious if the organizational layout is the same or similar to what I'm accustomed to in my nonprofit success pack org. So there we go. I can go and look up the organizational layout in a minute, but let's just talk about the model. What would be the best thing to do?
I think in this case, I would look at using a hybrid model, to split it because they are doing, actual sales. They're not currently using NPSP, so they're operating more like a business-to-business model. So I think I would continue that for those users, and then as they bring in the Razor's Edge folks, set up the household model.
And you could just be really careful with which profiles and thus users have access to what record types so that your B2B folks don't get confused being able to create households and such.
Mm-hmm.
Your security and permissions will become important. But yeah, I would agree, hybrid. And then as far as the the layout for organizational accounts, I mean, there is a page layout that comes with the Success Pack, but you can adjust it to look like what you had. Or you don't even have to use it. You can just continue using the one you have for organizational accounts. You just have to go in and adjust the page layout settings, or page layout assignments rather, sorry. Does that help, Maria?
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense.
Cool.
It's interesting. I got shouted down in the Power of Us Hub a couple of weeks ago when somebody asked a question about that was very similar to yours, which is whether you should install the Nonprofit Success Pack kind of in a vanilla org. And I suggested that that I felt it was easier to have it be one or the other. Like if you were going to have the Nonprofit Success Pack, that's what you should stick to. And of course, a whole bunch of people came out and said, no, we run both models quite happily in our organizations. And I think it is a little bit of a challenge, and it's an interesting one. I think that, what my thinking behind saying that you choose one or the other is because I think so much of the documentation is focused one way or the other, particularly the documentation around the Nonprofit Success Pack, that it does take, I think, quite a bit of research and thinking, particularly like Beth was saying about profiles and security settings, to make the two things work side by side. And that was kind of my reason. Yeah, that was my reason for saying it. But now I think it's Mark Stark is the person who told me about how they do it, and they've managed to kind of it's almost like they have their instance in two halves, and there's one side of their organization who are essentially using Salesforce as it was, and the other half who are using it for fundraising. But it certainly does have implications around you definitely have to do some tweaking of settings. Has anyone on the panel done this kind of idea? Have you essentially run the two things side by side, or are you mostly, if an organization has the Nonprofit Success Pack, that's it and everything's run that way?
I'm more the latter, but I don't see why you couldn't, especially when there's an established team that's already really accustomed to vanilla. But like you said, it's not going to be out of the box, and I think you would need a really strong admin in the org, which it looks like you have, to manage that and to, filter through documentation and figure out, okay, who am I helping? What model are they on? How do they see Salesforce? It definitely adds a layer of complexity, but I don't think it's impossible.
Yeah, I think I agree with Beth that you'd need a strong admin to make sure that everything stays in the works. So it may depend on the size of the nonprofit, to say whether or not that makes sense for them or not. If it's a smaller one, and you may not want to set everybody, have the overhead on the setting up the two different models. But I think especially where it's larger and they've already got people using it that way, I would say continue using it that way, and then adding in the donations and the NPSP for those people that are going to need that, and set up security.
And it has to be said, there are, as Beth mentioned earlier, there are some great fundraising features in the Nonprofit Success Pack around the roll-ups, around soft credits and splitting up of the soft credits, this whole GAU allocations. These are the sorts of automatic adding of people to campaigns, stuff around acknowledgements. These are all things that your fundraising folks will really love, and trying to create all of them yourself would be even more of a challenge, I think, than splitting your organization. Thank you. It's an interesting question, though, I think, and you get really quite sophisticated about that one. Thank you.
It's funny that you say that, Caroline, because I actually recently did just recreate relationships and affiliations in an org that's not using SuccessPack at all. Sorry.
Well, no, it's fine. Of course, relationships and affiliations are the ones actually that you can move across. It's all the newer stuff, I think, the soft credits
But the relationships and affiliations that you can use without are the old versions. Oh, you mean you can use the new versions without leveraging the other stuff? Yes. You're right. But as far as installing in isolation, the only ones you can use are the ancient ones that are not really worth it.
Yeah, okay. But
I don't, well, I mean, it's off topic, but I don't actually feel like they're not worth it at all. I often install, not
Mhm.
relationships, but I often install the affiliations, NPSP2, because, to install the nonprofit starter pack for a client that doesn't do fundraising and have that crazy bloat around it just for affiliations is something that I
Agreed.
just can't do. So I often use the V2 because there's actually some good code around it that, I mean, it's not as nice as V3, but it's pretty
Yeah,
close.
yeah,
And I
agreed.
often encourage our friends at the foundation to make a standalone version of the current NPSP for relationships and affiliations, and I encourage you to do so as well. It's constantly smacked down, but I think if more people ask for it, maybe we'll get it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I work with a lot of organizations who use other managed packages, and we almost always install relationships and affiliations to use alongside it, because they're great little tools, both of them.
And I agree with you, Sarah, that we need a lighter version. I actually have a checklist of here's how to deactivate as much automation as possible when you do have Success Pack. Because sometimes that's what you need, you know?
Yeah.
So there you are, Mara. That becomes even more interesting because once you have the nonprofit success pack, that's the other side of it, is to look if there are parts, parts of the organization who are using the Sales Cloud, if there are bits of the success pack that would be useful for them, and relationships and affiliations may actually they're applicable way beyond fundraising. Yeah, interesting is one word for it. Oh, okay, all right.
Good luck, Maria.
Absolutely. And yes, do go into the Power of Us hub. And I think if I'm fairly sure it's Mark Stark who replied to me. He had a good detailed explanation of how he's managed to get the two things working side by side. So he'll be a great resource. Question from Edward Delaney. We are a social services foundation, and we need to track about 1,500 clients with about 25 data points. We are also using this instance of the Nonprofit Success Pack for fundraising from donors and grant management. The clients are linked to 6 different offices, which we have set up as accounts. Should we track clients as contacts under each of these accounts, or create an object for clients? Edward, if you're on the line, do you want to unmute yourself and...
Yes, here I
Hi,
am.
great.
Thank you. How are you?
So, so you mean are your clients contacts at the moment, or?
Yeah, so we do immigration assistance work, and we call the participants clients, and they're receiving um, help from staff at 6 different locations. So we've been going back and forth about how we structure this, and so right now we're looking at setting up views, specific views for the staff, so they can access the different client information, and just managing that on the contact object. But we've gotten into quite a number of fields, about 24, 25 fields, but most of them have pick lists. And so we started considering setting up a specific object for the clients. And concerns have been, do we lose some of the built-in relationship to the accounts, with a custom object, and we're also concerned about reporting.
Sure. Those are very valid concerns, and I mean, I don't like to use absolutes, but I would actually say never make a custom object that represents a person when there's already the contact object. And I'm sure someone somewhere could come up with one maybe example of why that might be okay, but your user adoption would be so difficult because you can't lose any of those standard report types, and Salesforce is built on their CRM object model, and to try to replace a piece of it with something else would be a disaster. And frankly, 25 fields is a very low number of fields. I would not be concerned about that data on the contact object. I commonly
Okay,
see
very
contacts
good.
that have 300 or 400 data
That
points on them.
confirmed some of the information we've gleaned from the hub, but there have been a couple of examples of using objects, but that definitely confirms, and that was getting us, the object concept was getting us into an area that we're not really comfortable with yet on the platform.
Well, yeah, I don't even know if you were, even if you were super comfortable with it. I mean, I've been working in Salesforce for more years than I will admit, and I would never do that. I
Okay.
think, so sometimes though, but what you're talking about, like, I can't say I fully understand your entire scenario, but um, in terms of the like data points that you're capturing, it is sometimes the case where you have the contact record that represents a person, and then you might have a child object under it to represent a set of data. But the only time I recommend doing that is when you have either more than 500 fields you're tracking, so it's just going to be like too close to the field limit on the contact object,
Right.
or when you have time-based data. So like, for example, if you have volunteers that are coming in and filling in a form each year and you want to run analytics across the data year over year, then you would want a child object to capture that data because you would have it dated, right? You'd have this is for 2010 and this is for 2011 and this is for 2012. Um,
Right.
but where you just have one set of data that you're always maintaining what is essentially the most recent version of, there's really not a reason to move it off of the contact into a child object.
Okay.
I totally
Yeah,
agree with everything Sarah has just said. Are you using a record type for the clients?
We are.
Okay. So those 25 fields are not on the page layout when you bring up a donor contact record.
Correct.
Great. Yeah. I think that's I totally agree with everything Sarah just said. Susan?
Yeah, we've got a pretty good handle on page layouts and limiting views, for I guess I'd say for security purposes, because a number of the client data points are related to health and personal information. So I think we've gotten a good handle on locking down the client data to specific staff people.
Yeah, and I was going to say I agree. The other time that I've seen a child object is when you do have a security concern. But that you can do so much with field security and things that you pretty much you can use the account in different record types. So I agree with what Sarah said on that one.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah.
And out of interest, Edward, you said about the clients being linked to the different offices, and how are you creating that link?
So that's really, I wasn't sure what word to use, but so the clients are, each different location is set up as a account, I believe we did household accounts rather than organization, but we set up each location as an account, and then the clients are contacts under that account. So there'll be about 200 contacts related to that account.
How have you related those by affiliations?
Oh, they're
Uh,
direct. Sounds like they're directly under the account.
I think it's direct, yeah.
correct.
So I'll push on that a little bit. Are none of the clients related to one another? Family units and such?
Um, as far, are they related as family?
Yeah, like of those 1,500 folks, are there no families within that?
There are.
Okay, so how are you representing
There's
those
like,
family units right now?
there are families. So there are, there's typically a single point of contact.
Okay.
But there are spouses and then children. And
So it would probably be a fair bit of work to make a shift, given that the data is already set up this way. But what I would recommend, if I were coming to that scenario fresh, given the limited information we've just gathered,
right,
would be to use the household account model sort of as it's intended, where you have the account is just that family unit, that household, and you have just those, 2 or 3 or 4 folks or more, or one actually,
right.
under that account, and there is a way of marking a primary who is that primary point of contact for that household. And then I would probably just have a custom account lookup field on the household that is like which office is taking care of this group,
Okay,
which office is this household working with. And then what that will give you, that custom lookup will give you a related list on that office's account of here's all the families or all the households that this office is supporting. So you'll still have that related list, but it'll be based on a different field.
okay. And we're like in a beta phase, so we've only inputted about 75 clients just to have some data.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
so
then
we're,
easy. I would definitely switch. I don't know,
okay,
Sarah and Susan, would you
Change
think
it. Yeah,
differently?
change it. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
definitely change it. Yeah. And you want to look at whether or not they're at multiple offices
Yeah,
at
sorry, that was
any
an
point.
assumption I made.
no, they're all managed by a single office.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
if you
then I
can
agree
promise
with.
that that is forever, then what I said stands. Sorry, I was making an assumption.
Yep, that's okay. Yeah, definitely if you're in beta, make the change because you'll be much happier.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, I think
Then what that also opens up is that you can use, like you could use cases to represent points of contact with that family or that household. Like
Right,
you'd have
that
some
came up as an
interesting,
issue of something that
yep,
would be worthwhile being able to use cases. So,
yep, definitely a lightweight use of cases for case management like this, and I would check out Console too, um, because we have Console available to us now under the Salesforce.org granted licenses, and for that sort of human services casework, it can be super powerful.
I'm sorry, what's that called?
Console.
Console.
Um, Let me pull up a blog post.
I was going to say, Beth, I know you have access to an amazing blog post all about console. So,
Yeah,
if you'd
where
like to,
was that on his personal blog or was that on the Bigger Boat
it
blog?
was on Biggerboat.
Oh, okay, that's why I'm not seeing it here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Beth's colleague Christian did a great blog post about how you would use the console in a nonprofit setting. I set up a sales team on it on the strength of that blog's post. So, yes, please put the link.
Nice.
And I'm thinking also, I think again this whole advantage of putting your clients in the households, I can think of a couple of other things. One is that if you ever had to do any grant reporting around how many households did you serve versus how many individuals,
Definitely,
um, um,
definitely.
that would help. And the other thing, of course, is that you always hope that at some point when you have served these clients, they may eventually come back and have a different relationship with your organization, maybe as donors or volunteers or whatever. And I think already having them in the household sets up for those future relationships too.
Very good.
And I've when I've done caseworkers and organizations, I think the lookup is great as a starting point, but I've also used affiliations to for people with in the client I worked with, their housing associations, but we use the affiliations for that because again you can track the history as you go to and fro as they move organizations.
It does make reporting a little bit trickier. That's the only thing.
Affiliations, yeah, I agree. That and
reporting.
yeah, and you can't really do the related list, can you? Or you can, but it's a sort of related list of affiliations which can be mixed up with some other things. So, yeah, I think the lookup is a great starting point. Much simpler. Fantastic.
Yeah, going back
again,
to the.
As we said earlier, you can always transition that lookup into affiliations really easily down the line if you change your mind and say, oh, well, actually, 2 offices could support them, or just that lookup isn't robust enough to track what we want to track. It would not be a huge deal to sort of internally migrate that lookup data into affiliations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
The other problem with a custom object that we didn't mention is counts actually will get upgraded. Hopefully, as we continue down the road with Salesforce, and so if you have a custom object, obviously you don't gain any enhancements that might come down the road. So.
Right.
Yeah. And Edward, I put 2 links in the chat window there for you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Welcome.
Great. We have a couple of minutes, but in case anyone has any more quick questions. But I think this has turned into an interesting discussion. I think it's the account model can seem quite sort of cut and dried or straightforward, I guess, when you start looking into Salesforce. But actually, there's a lot of variance and sophistication, and I think it can get interesting how you do things. Are there any other the panel? Are there any other examples that or things that you'd sort of? We've discussed a different set of account models here. Anything occur to you that we haven't said, or any types of account models that you've worked with that are interesting?
Well, I think one thing that we didn't get into, and it could be a moot point for just depending on who's doing the implementation, but there are different reasons to choose one-to-one versus bucket if you're not using households. And so I would just point out a couple, which are that if you are using a bucket model, you should not have more than 10,000 records in any given bucket. And so if you have, 200,000 contacts, you need to come up with a scheme that kind of makes multiple buckets for people to be involved in. And then on the other side of the coin, if you're using a one-to-one where you have one account per contact, one named account per contact for everybody you don't have an employer relationship for, if your org has a lot of data, that drastically increases your data size because it's 2K per account per person. So if you're adding in 1 million contacts, that's going to really blow out your data storage. And so those are just kind of considerations that, for which of those 2 models to use. And there's also security considerations around using bucket accounts if you also use cases, which almost makes them impossible to use in that scenario.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. I mean, that one used to be one of the big advantages of the bucket account, wasn't it? That it could, in some cases, it definitely could save you some data storage. Yeah. And you then had to be really careful to make sure that nobody could ever delete the bucket account. There was far too much information would disappear with it. And for those who don't know what we're talking, the idea of a bucket account is that instead of having a household or an individual account for every individual, you have this one account, or one or several accounts, which are basically called individual, and everyone goes in there to save some space and to take care of how they donate. Great.
I once inherited an org that had 250,000 people in a bucket account, a single bucket.
Oh,
Yeah, that was fun.
Oh, that's
that would have
awesome.
been an interesting migration. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But of course, that's what people used to do, isn't it? I mean, if you,
Yep.
it's often the model for people who've been on the Salesforce platform for a number of years or right at the beginning. Often they have those bucket accounts. So
Mm-hmm.
cool. That's great. Thank you very much. We've got to the hour, and my husband is waiting to whisk me off out on a trip for the day. So
Yay.
thank
Have a
you.
great day.
Thank you, everyone who's joined us on the call and joined us for this discussion. Thank you very much indeed to our panel for on the kind of eve of New Year's Eve, being willing to come in and give their time. Everybody, I wish you all a very happy new year, and office hours will be back in January with a general Q&A. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline,
Thank
for
you.
another good
Thanks
year.
so much.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.